On my wedding day, my name Danica Lowell echoed through a chapel filled with guests, but not a single person from my own family stood up to greet me. 3 empty rows stared back at me like a punishment I still didn't understand. And just when I thought abandonment was the worst they could do, my father proved me wrong. He showed up later with cops. That was the moment I realized the people meant to protect me had become the ones willing to break me. And everything that came after started from there. The moment I stepped into the chapel at Stone Ridge, a strange stillness pressed against my chest. The wooden beams above me carried the faint scent of pine, and through the tall glass windows, winter sunlight stretched across the valley like a sheet of cold silver. Guests murmured softly, their voices echoing in the open space, as if the mountain itself was listening. Evan's hand found mine, warm and steady, but it didn't quiet the sharp sting rising in my throat. 3 rows on the left side of the aisle rows meant for the people who had known me all my life sat untouched. No coats draped over the backs of chairs. No familiar footsteps rushing in late. No faces turning to smile at me. Just absence. Heavy and deliberate, I kept my spine straight, pretending that the hollow inside me wasn't widening with every second. The wind slipped through the cracks between the old boards, a draft colder than it should have been, brushing against my dress like a warning. Even the candles near the altar seemed uneasy, their flames trembling as if they were aware of the truth I was trying not to acknowledge. When a guest whispered, quiet but not quite enough, asking if no one had come for the bride's side, the words sliced clean through my composure. I didn't flinch, but the echo of that question lodged itself deep, settling where the hope for a different day had once lived. I tried to take a breath, but it felt like breathing around a bruise. This was supposed to be a beginning. Yet it felt like the confirmation of something I'd been avoiding for years. They weren't coming. Not today. Not for me. And even though I didn't know why, the wound their absence carved would become the thread that pulled everything else apart. 4 years before that hollow wedding morning, my world had already begun to crack. The fire started on the outskirts of Boulder, the kind of blaze that eats through dry grass faster than a person can think. Wind whipped through the hills in violent, unpredictable bursts, sending embers flying like sparks from an angry forge. By the time our family got word, flames were already curling around the old storage shed behind our house. My father stood in the yard, jaw clenched, shouting over the roar of burning timber. He had spent 2 decades fighting fires, and I had grown up watching him run into danger without a flinch. But that day, when the shed caught, something changed in him. He barked at me to save the battered ambulance he kept inside, a relic from his early years of service, something he treated as if it carried the last good piece of his identity. I heard him, but at that exact moment, a thin, terrified cry rose from the cabin at the north edge of the property. A child's voice. High, sharp, desperate. It cut through every other sound. Instinct and training collided, and instinct won. I sprinted toward this cabin, the heat licking my shoulders as I pried open the warped door and pulled a boy into my arms just as part of the roof caved behind us. As I carried him out, coughing through the smoke, I looked toward my father. His eyes met mine, but there was no relief in them, no pride, only a blade of betrayal, clean and final. Behind him, the shed collapsed, taking the ambulance with it in a burst of sparks. I didn't realize until much later that the flames had swallowed more than metal. They had taken the last thing he believed proved his worth. In the days that followed, I learned what he told my brothers, that I had chosen a stranger over my own blood. And those words stuck. They grew roots in our house, spreading into every silence that followed. Weeks later, an elderly neighbor pulled me aside to confess something my father never would. He had been drowning in debt. That ambulance wasn't just sentimental. It was collateral he planned to use to secure a loan. Its loss wasn't just financial. It was the collapse of the one thing he thought he still had control over. His anger, I realized, had nothing to do with the fire at all. It was about losing the last piece of himself he could still point to with pride. And I had been the easiest person to blame. That moment became the quiet fracture that would later split my family wide open. Months before my wedding, I had still been naive enough to hope that time might have softened the edges between us. I mailed the invitations to my father and brothers. tucking a small handwritten note inside, unsure whether it would ever be read. A week later, the envelope came back to me, unopened. The paper was cold from the winter air. Edges curled where snow had melted and refrozen. A postal stamp from Boulder stretched across the front like a scar. No explanation, no acknowledgement, only a text from my father, hours later. "Don't expect anything from us." I placed the envelope on the kitchen counter and stared at it far longer than I should have, as if waiting for it to shift, to show a sign of misunderstanding, but it stayed still, as unmoved as the people it came from. Evan found me there, turning the paper over in my hands until it wrinkled. He didn't say a word, his silence gentle, a stark contrast to theirs, which had always felt like a door slammed shut. I tried to swallow the hurt, but it lodged itself beneath my ribs. Days later, Mrs. Abernathy, the neighbor who used to slip me homemade cookies when I was little, called out of the blue. Her voice trembled as she explained that my father and brothers were drowning in debt and too ashamed to ask for help, that maybe the distance wasn't about anger anymore, but humiliation, for the first time. Doubt crept in. Maybe the wildfire hadn't been the only reason they pushed me away. Maybe they weren't trying to stay out of my life. They were trying to keep me from seeing how far they had fallen. But the twist came quietly. Settling in only after I hung up the phone, they hadn't stayed silent because they didn't care. They stayed silent because asking for my help felt worse than losing me entirely. And that kind of pride, I would soon learn, doesn't just keep people from reaching out, it pushes them to take. It happened on a Monday morning. The kind where everything feels ordinary until it suddenly isn't. I was finishing a damage summary when Evan walked in holding a thick court envelope, its red seal stark against the paper. I didn't think much of it at first, but the moment I saw the header, the room tightened around me. My name appeared beside the word suspect, the accusation misappropriating family savings, and the complainant was my father. For a second, I felt pinned in place, as if the cold drifting in through the cracked window had frozen me from the inside out. Reading further only deepened the confusion. The so-called missing funds came from a savings account tied to my mother, an account I'd never heard of. There was no signature from her, no acknowledgement she'd even been involved. It felt like someone had cleanly carved her out of her own records. Then came the demand from the court I had to provide timestamps of a specific night, GPS logs, and work witnesses. Someone had told them I'd been spotted near my father's property. The implication curled like smoke. Whoever built this story wanted me trapped, not questioned. I flipped to the signature on the last page. It was supposedly my father's, but the handwriting was too smooth, too controlled. His real signature had grown shaky over the years. This one looked painfully similar to another signature I'd seen on a birthday card at my brother's place. Mark's handwriting. The weight of it settled heavily. This wasn't just my father acting alone. Something far more coordinated was happening behind my back. I woke to my phone vibrating under the pillow, its screen glowing with a message demanding I return the money. A short audio clip waited underneath. When I pressed play, the voice slurred, low, and edging on anger hit me like a punch. I knew that voice. Evan. After listening, confirmed it without hesitation. It was Mark. The knot in my chest tightened as I pulled out my mother's old documents again, searching for anything I had missed. That was when I noticed the pattern 2 bank accounts opened months earlier under her name, withdrawals that lined up almost perfectly with periods when both my brothers were struggling. The math wasn't subtle. They didn't just need money, they needed someone to carry the fallout. Then I found a transfer of $900 attributed to me, but the digital footprint traced back to a bar where Mark practically lived. At the time of the transfer, I had been knee-deep in floodwater miles away. Whoever staged this didn't care about precision-only damage. Later that morning, tucked between bills in my mailbox, I found a handwritten note. The curve of the letters, the rushed angles, I recognized Luke's handwriting instantly. The threat was short, promising that things would escalate if I didn't cooperate. The same handwriting had appeared in the court file. The truth settled over me with brutal clarity. It wasn't one brother, or even just my father. They were working together, building a version of reality where I was the villain. And standing there under the dim porch light, I realized they weren't simply angry at me. They were desperate enough to destroy me if it meant saving themselves. At 7:15, the pounding at my door snapped me out of the last thin layer of sleep I had. Denver was buried under fresh snow, the kind that made the whole street look still and harmless. But the moment I opened the door, everything inside me went rigid. My father stood between two Jefferson County officers, snow melting off his coat, his face set like stone. For a heartbeat, I wondered if he'd come to talk. He didn't. He told them he wanted to report me for breaking into his home. It felt like the floor tilted. He handed over a blurry video pulled from the backyard camera, a hooded figure moving quickly across the screen, the timestamp matching the night the money supposedly vanished. One officer compared the footage to me, eyes scanning my height and build before saying the resemblance was there. My cheeks burned despite the cold pouring in behind them. I forced myself to stay calm and pulled up my FEMA GPS log. The timestamp showed I'd been more than 100 miles away on duty that entire night. One officer nodded, but my father immediately claimed I could have hired someone else. Even the officers looked thrown by how far he was willing to stretch the accusation. They asked about shoe prints found in his yard. When I said I wore a 7.5, they exchanged a look. The prints were size 11.5, exactly the size Mark wore. My father hesitated, then muttered something about visitors. That tiny pause told me more truth than anything he'd said all morning. But the final crack appeared when the officers questioned how he accessed the camera system. My mother had set the password years ago, and he never remembered it. Yet here he was, presenting video he supposedly pulled himself. When pressed, he admitted Mark had sent it to him. The officers examined the footage again and pointed out warped metadata. The hooded figure wore a type of beanie sold only at a store next to Rusty Bluff, the bar Mark practically lived in. My father couldn't look at me after that, his gaze fixed somewhere past my shoulder, as if meeting my eyes would shatter something he wasn't ready to face. And standing there with snow soaking into the doorway, I realized my family had constructed the entire scene. They wanted the officers to leave with me in handcuffs. They almost succeeded. I hoped the confrontation would be the breaking point, that maybe seeing the truth exposed would slow whatever was spiraling out of control. Instead, a new blow landed before noon. FEMA emailed me a notice. A complaint had been filed accusing me of misusing internal data. My Level 4 clearance was suspended pending review. One short message, and suddenly, my job, my anchor, was slipping from under me. Evan studied the attached letter and recognized the handwriting immediately. The slanted letters, the heavy pressure on every Y, the strange loop on the L. It was Luke's. The realization tightened something deep in my chest. My oldest brother wasn't just involved, he was actively pushing me toward a cliff. Later, a coworker pulled me aside during lunch to share that someone had called the office 3 times asking about my disciplinary history, digging for anything that could be twisted into ammunition. My father had always believed a person's past was the easiest way to destroy their present. Hearing that tactic turned on me made my stomach turn, but the sharpest hit came in the afternoon. When a hospital bill addressed to my mother showed up in my mailbox, the payment had been made through an account under my name, an account I never opened. Someone had stolen my identity, created a trail, and handed it over as evidence. That evening, Evan pulled up the security footage from our street. Mark appeared twice in the recordings, standing under the street lamp, staring at our window, phone in hand. Both visits happened the week before the court notice arrived. Evan's voice was low when he said they'd planned this from the start, and as I stared at Mark's blurred outline on the screen, I understood something bitter and irrevocable. My family wasn't acting out of anger. They were acting out of desperation, and they were willing to drag me under to keep themselves afloat. Driving back to Boulder felt like forcing myself into a past I'd spent years avoiding. The old house stood exactly where I'd left it, quiet and hollow, the fence still scarred from the fire. A cold wind slipped through the charred boards and carried that faint, unmistakable smell of ash. Stepping inside was like opening a door to a room I'd locked in my mind. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. In the kitchen, The lowest cabinet let out its familiar cack as I pulled it open. Beneath a stack of greasy bills sat a leather-bound notebook I'd never seen before. Page after page listed loans under my mother's name, each ending with the same promise: Mark will repay. He never had. She had hidden every one of his debts, carrying them quietly while the rest of us went on believing everything was fine. The weight of what she'd protected and what they'd taken pressed hard against my chest. Outside, Mr. Peterson waved me over and admitted he'd seen strangers going in and out of the house for months. One woman stayed so long she practically lived there. His words snapped every scattered detail in place: the altered video, the wrong shoe size, the unfamiliar silhouette. I found Mark at Rusty Bluff, slumped against his car, drunk and defeated. He confessed more than I expected. They needed money. My father believed I owed them. And the woman in the video wasn't me. It was Mark's ex, using an old key. They'd staged everything, not out of anger, but out of desperation. The morning of the hearing felt colder than any Denver winter. The fluorescent lights inside the county building cast a pale glare over rows of wooden benches, and the air carried that familiar sterile scent of paper and dust. I stood before the panel, my hands steady, though exhaustion clung to every part of me. Across the room, my father sat rigid in the complainant's seat, while Mark and Luke hovered behind him like shadows, unwilling to step into their own blame. When the proceedings began, the FEMA representative stepped forward with the GPS logs. The panel studied the data, scrolling through timestamps without expression. The evidence placed me more than 100 miles away at the rescue station during the exact time the video claimed I'd been near my father's home. Their conclusion was swift and matter-of-fact. I could not have been anywhere near the alleged scene. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt ripple through the room. A technical analyst took the stand next, pulling up the backyard footage my father had turned over. He explained how the timestamp had been altered, how the metadata revealed the file had passed through 3 devices before reaching the police. The final device, he noted, belonged to someone named Mark Lowell. My father shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, a tremor running through his shoulders as the panel turned toward him. I placed the leather notebook on the table. The panel leaned in as I opened it to page after page of my mother's handwriting notes of every loan she had quietly taken, each one tied to Mark. And at the bottom of the final page, the line that had crushed me the moment I read it: "Don't let Danica know." The silence that followed felt heavier than any accusation. It was the kind of silence that comes when truth stops needing to argue. Then the officers escorted in a woman I recognized only from photographs: Mark's ex-girlfriend. Her voice wavered as she admitted she had crossed the yard that night, wearing the hooded jacket, using an old key. She confessed they'd asked her to stage the break-in so they could claim I'd taken the money. They'd offered to settle her debts in return. The moment she finished, the panel issued their ruling. The accusations were false. The evidence, fabricated. I was cleared of every charge. The file would be closed permanently. I turned toward them, my father, my brothers, and spoke the only words that still felt true. I never took anything from my family. I only took back my life. My father bowed his head, and for the first time, I saw not the man who raised me, but a man hollowed out by his own choices, smaller than the ashes he once stood bravely against. 3 months after the hearing, Colorado exhaled into spring, snow retreated up the mountains, and wildflowers pushed through the thawed earth like small acts of courage. Life felt quieter, lighter, as if the world had finally loosened its grip around my ribs. Kid, Lydia, one of the trainees I had mentored years ago, a girl who'd lost her father far too young, reached out and asked if I would walk her down the aisle. She said she wanted someone who had stood beside her when life was hardest. I agreed without hesitation, though a familiar ache settled under my ribs as the day approached. When the church doors opened and music filled the room, Lydia slipped her arm through mine and leaned in close. Her whisper was barely a breath, yet it hit me harder than any verdict or confrontation ever had. "Thank you for showing up." The words wrapped around a part of me I didn't realize was still bruised. In that moment, standing in the warm glow of the sanctuary, It felt like someone handed back the piece of my own wedding day that had been stolen. Outside, the sun cast a golden stretch over the Rocky Mountains. Not triumph, not vengeance, just peace, the kind I had fought for, the kind I finally chose for myself. I can't choose the family I was born into, but I can choose the kind of person I become, and I choose to be someone who shows up even when the people who raised me never did.